Welcome to Fearful Frequencies, where every story is a signal from the shadows. Tune in, if you dare, and let the whispers of the unknown send chills down your spine. But beware, once you hear the haunting echoes of these tales, you may never listen to the silence the same way again. If you enjoy these stories, consider subscribing on Patreon at www.patreon.com/fearfulfrequencies. Link in description. So, in the deed of night, when the world is silent and shadows grow long, there are frequencies that tap into our deepest fears. Gather yourself and listen. This story is called The Echoes of Blackwood Manor. Introduction. Nestled deep in the dense woods of New Hampshire, miles away from the nearest town, stands Blackwood Manor. The old, decaying mansion was once a grand estate, built in the late 1800s by a wealthy businessman named Theodore Blackwood. After the mysterious disappearance of the entire Blackwood family in 1903, the manor was abandoned and left to rot. Locals avoided the area, speaking in hushed tones about the eerie sounds that emanated from the woods and the strange figures seen lurking in the shadows. Over the years, many have ventured into Blackwood Manor, but few have returned, and those who did were never the same. This is the story of one such venture. Part 1. The Invitation. It was a cold, misty October evening when I received the letter. I had been working as a freelance journalist, specializing in the paranormal for several years. My reputation had grown, and I was often sought out by thrill seekers and ghost hunters. The letter was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged, and the paper yellowed with age. Dear Mr. Graves, I have heard of your expertise in matters of the supernatural and believe that you may be of assistance in solving a mystery that has plagued my family for generations. I have inherited Blackwood Manor and wish to uncover the truth behind the strange occurrences within its walls. I invite you to spend a week at the manor to document your findings. I will compensate you generously for your time. Sincerely, Edward Blackwood. The name Blackwood sent a shiver down my spine. I had heard the legends and read the stories, but the opportunity to explore the infamous Blackwood Manor was too tempting to pass up. I packed my bags and made the long journey to New Hampshire, arriving just as the sun began to set. Part 2. The Manor. The drive up to the manor was unnerving. The winding road was lined with gnarled trees, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air grew colder as I approached, and a thick fog enveloped the area, obscuring my view of the manor until I was almost upon it. Blackwood Manor loomed before me, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. The windows were dark, and the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. I hesitated for a moment before stepping out of my car and approaching the entrance. As I pushed open the door, the smell of dampness and decay hit me. The interior was just as dilapidated as the exterior, with peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and layers of dust coating every surface. The only sound was the echo of my footsteps as I ventured further inside. I called out for Edward, but there was no response. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Undeterred, I decided to explore the manor on my own, hoping to find some clues or evidence of the paranormal. Part 3. The Echoes. The first night in the manor was uneventful, though I could feel a presence watching me as I set up my equipment. The old grandfather clock in the foyer struck midnight, its chime echoing through the empty halls, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I began my investigation in the library, where the Blackwoods had reportedly conducted seances and other occult practices. The room was filled with dusty books and strange artifacts, and the atmosphere was thick with an oppressive energy. As I scanned the room with my EMF detector, it suddenly spiked, and I heard a faint whisper in my ear. "Leave! Before it's too late!" I spun around, but there was no one there. I shook off the unease and continued my search, finding an old diary tucked away on one of the shelves. The cover was cracked and worn, but the pages were surprisingly well preserved. The diary belonged to Victoria Blackwood, Theodore's wife, and it detailed her descent into madness as the family became increasingly obsessed with the occult. She wrote of strange rituals, ghostly apparitions, and a malevolent force that seemed to control the manor. Her final entry was a chilling warning. The house is alive. It feeds on our fears and traps our souls within its walls. We can never leave. Part 4. The Haunting. Over the next few days, the activity in the manor escalated. Doors slammed shut on their own, disembodied footsteps echoed through the halls, and shadowy figures lurked in the corners of my vision. I recorded everything, but each night as I reviewed the footage, I found that the most disturbing events were never captured on camera. One night, I was awoken by the sound of a child crying. I followed the sound to one of the upstairs bedrooms, where I found an old, tattered doll sitting on the bed. The crying stopped as soon as I entered the room, and the temperature dropped suddenly. My breath came out in visible puffs as I approached the doll, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. As I reached out to touch the doll, it turned its head towards me, its glassy eyes staring into mine. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and the door slammed shut behind me. The crying resumed, louder and more frantic, and I felt something cold brush against my arm. I bolted from the room, not stopping until I was back in the relative safety of the library. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew that the manor was toying with me, testing my resolve. Part 5. The Descent. The longer I stayed in the manor, the more it seemed to close in on me. The walls felt like they were breathing, the floors creaked under invisible weight, and the shadows grew darker and more oppressive. I became increasingly paranoid, jumping at every little sound and shadow. On the fourth day, I found a hidden passage behind a bookshelf in the library. The narrow, winding staircase led down to a dark basement, the air thick with the stench of mold and decay. My flashlight flickered as I descended, and I felt a growing sense of unease. The basement was filled with old, rusted chains and shackles, and strange symbols were etched into the stone walls. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its surface cracked and smeared with something dark. As I approached, I saw my reflection flicker and distort, and then something moved behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. When I turned back to the mirror, I saw the figure of a man standing beside me, his face gaunt and eyes hollow. He reached out towards me, his fingers brushing the glass, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I screamed and stumbled back, the figure in the mirror vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I fled the basement, but the image of that hollow-eyed man haunted me, his touch lingering like frostbite. Part 6. The Unraveling. By the fifth day, I was barely sleeping, my nerves frayed and my mind unraveling. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. I had lost track of time, the days blending into one long nightmare-fueled haze. I tried to leave the manor, but every time I approached the front door, it was as if an invisible force pushed me back, my limbs growing heavy and my vision blurring. The manor wouldn't let me go. That night, as I sat in the library, desperately searching through Victoria's diary for some clue, some way to escape, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. They were slow and deliberate, echoing through the hallways, growing louder and closer with each passing second. I knew that whatever was coming was not human. The footsteps stopped just outside the library door, and I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside, its face hidden in the shadows. It was Edward Blackwood. But something was wrong. His eyes were vacant, his movements stiff and unnatural. He moved towards me with a jerky, puppet-like gait, and I realized with horror that he was not in control of his own body. "Help! Me!" he croaked, his voice strained and raspy. "It won't let me leave." I backed away, my mind racing. Edward's body convulsed, his limbs twisting at unnatural angles, and he let out a blood-curdling scream as his skin began to wither and crack. The entity controlling him was using his body like a puppet, manipulating his movements to torment me. I watched in helpless horror as Edward's body was contorted and twisted, his bones snapping with sickening crunches. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Edward's body slumped to the floor, lifeless, and the room grew deathly silent. Part 7. The Revelation. I knew I couldn't stay in the manor any longer. I had to find a way out, but the front door was still barred by an unseen force. I remembered the mirror in the basement, the strange symbols etched into the walls, and the way the figure had reached out to me. The mirror was the key. I returned to the basement, my heart pounding in my chest, and stood before the mirror once more. The surface was still cracked, the dark smears still visible, but now I could see the faint outline of a door behind the glass. I reached out, pressing my hand against the cold surface, and felt a strange sensation, like I was being pulled into the mirror. The glass rippled like water, and my hand passed through, followed by my arm, and then the rest of my body. On the other side, I found myself in a dark, narrow corridor, the walls lined with flickering candles. The air was thick with the scent of burning wax and something else, something metallic. At the end of the corridor was a large wooden door, and as I approached, I could hear the faint sound of chanting coming from the other side. I pushed the door open and stepped into a circular chamber, the walls covered in strange symbols and the floor stained with dried blood. In the center of the chamber was an altar, and on it lay a book bound in human skin. The chanting grew louder, and I saw shadowy figures surrounding the altar, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. One of the figures stepped forward, lowering its hood to reveal the face of Victoria Blackwood. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and lifeless, but her expression was one of twisted glee. "We have been waiting for you," she said, her voice echoing in the chamber. "The house demands a sacrifice, and you have been chosen." Before I could react, the shadowy figures lunged at me, their cold hands gripping my arms and legs, dragging me towards the altar. I struggled, but their strength was inhuman, and I was powerless to resist. They placed me on the altar, and Victoria raised the book, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. The symbols on the walls began to glow, and the air grew thick with a malevolent energy. I could feel the life being drained from my body, my vision darkening, my strength fading. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Victoria's face, twisted into a grotesque smile. Part 8. The Legacy. I awoke in the library, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I was alive, but the memory of what had happened in the chamber was still fresh in my mind. I knew I had to leave the manor before it claimed me for good. I grabbed my bags and bolted for the front door, half expecting the unseen force to stop me again. But this time the door swung open easily, and I stumbled outside into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I drove away from the manor, I could still feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I never returned to Blackwood Manor, and I never spoke of what happened there to anyone. But the nightmares have never stopped, and I can still hear the echoes of that dark, twisted place in my mind. And sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I can feel the cold hand of the manor reaching out for me, reminding me that I will never truly escape. For Blackwood Manor is alive, and it will never let go of those it has claimed. Epilogue. Months later, I received another letter, this time from a distant relative of the Blackwood family. They had heard of my experience and wanted to warn me that the manor was not done with me yet. "The house is a parasite," the letter read. It feeds on the fear and suffering of those who enter its walls. You may have escaped, but you will always be connected to it. Be careful, for it will find a way to bring you back. I burned the letter, but the fear remains. Blackwood Manor is out there, waiting, and I know that one day it will call me back. And when it does, I don't think I'll be able to resist. Conclusion. This is the story of Blackwood Manor, a place where the line between the living and the dead is blurred, and where the echoes of the past are never truly silenced. If you ever find yourself drawn to its decaying walls, remember this: the house is alive and it will never let you go.